The transmission began without warning. Across the galaxy, millions of screens flickered, hijacked by a signal bearing the unmistakable insignia of the Galactic Council. The seal, a metallic sphere encircled by 12 burning stars, hovered for a moment before dissolving into the image of a vast, dimly lit chamber. A cold, sterile voice spoke. The council convenes. Rows of figures stood in shadow, their forms obscured by the artificial gloom. The central dais was bathed in sterile blue light, illuminating a line of small, trembling silhouettes, children, no older than 10, dressed in plain white garments. Shackled at the wrists, they stood on a raised platform, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. Their captors, tall, armored beings, loomed behind them, gripping energy staffs that pulsed faintly with power. At the chamber's heart, a being of towering stature stepped forward. High Chancellor Voreth, his elongated skull crowned with ceremonial filigree, lifted a single, clawed hand. The murmurs in the darkness ceased. His deep, resonant voice echoed across the vast hall. These creatures stand accused of high treason against the balance of the cosmos. The words carried a weight that made the air feel heavy. Throughout the galaxy, those watching held their breath. The charge, treason, was no minor offense in the eyes of the council. It warranted only one sentence. A murmur rippled through the chamber. From the darkness, an Earth delegate, Ambassador Leor, stepped forward, his face drawn with barely restrained fury. His voice wavered but held firm. This is a grotesque farce. These are children. Their only crime is being human. You cannot justify this. Voreth turned his head slightly, regarding the ambassador with something close to amusement. His luminous eyes, devoid of pupils, reflected no emotion. Justification? The council requires none. Earth has defied the accord, sent envoys where none were permitted, sowed rebellion among the fragile threads of order. Consequences are inevitable. Leor clenched his fists, his breath sharp. This is not justice. It is balance, Voreth replied coolly. He lifted a hand. A low hum filled the chamber. The guards stepped forward, placing their weapons at the base of each child's skull. The children flinched but did not cry out. They had been here long enough to know what awaited them. Across Earth, billions watched in horror. In the chambers of power, military leaders turned away from their screens, hands tightening into fists. Civilian crowds filled streets, screaming in rage, in grief, in helplessness. The message was clear: the Galactic Council did not negotiate with Earth. They punished. The executioner, a silent figure clad in black, approached the first child in the line. His gloved hand hovered over the activation panel of his staff. The moment stretched impossibly long. Then, a sound cut through the tense silence. A voice, small yet clear. One of the children, a girl with dark curls framing her pale face, stepped forward. Despite her shackles, despite the overwhelming presence of her captors, she lifted her chin. Her voice did not waver. You are afraid of us. A ripple of unease passed through the gathered council members. Voreth's gaze flickered to her, a faint furrow appearing between his brows. Fear, he repeated, his tone carefully neutral. The girl nodded. You wouldn't do this if you weren't afraid of what will become. Silence. A dangerous silence. Then, Voreth sighed. Not in frustration, not in anger, but in something closer to resignation. He gestured sharply. The executioner pressed the activation panel. Blinding light. A sharp, electric hum. The first child collapsed. Earth's screams shattered the night. One by one, the children fell, their small bodies crumpling like discarded dolls. The broadcast continued without interruption, transmitting each execution in unflinching clarity. Leor turned away, his shoulders trembling. In every human city, rage burned hotter than the brightest suns. The message was sent. The council's will was final. As the last body fell, Voreth turned his gaze to the camera, as if looking directly at Earth itself. Send your strongest, he said, voice quiet, deliberate. It will change nothing. The transmission ended. In the war rooms of Earth, the response was immediate. The council had issued a challenge. And Earth would answer. The silence in the war chamber was suffocating. Screens flickered, replaying the transmission in endless loops, each frame a fresh wound. The weight of it pressed against the gathered officials, military commanders, political leaders, strategists, all of them hardened, all of them helpless in the face of what had just unfolded. The execution of Earth's children had not been a mere act of violence. It had been a declaration of supremacy. A challenge. President Dane's fingers drummed once against the metal table before stilling. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. We answer. No one questioned the statement. The only question was how. Across the table, General Elias Voss straightened. He had remained silent throughout the briefing, watching, waiting. Where others had flinched at the footage, his expression had not changed. He was not a man known for sentimentality, nor for hesitation. Those who opposed Earth knew his name, and those who followed him did so with both fear and admiration. Voss had spent decades waging wars that were never officially recognized. His victories had ended conflicts before they began, his strategies precise, ruthless. He had seen peace brokered through annihilation, order restored through calculated devastation. He leaned forward now, his voice carrying the finality of a hammer falling on steel. Give me command. The room shifted. Eyes flickered between one another, uncertain, wary. Voss was a weapon, but one that cut indiscriminately. A woman in diplomatic robes, Minister Elenya, spoke. The Council wants us to retaliate. They expect an emotional response, reckless, desperate. If we do as they predict, they will crush us before we ever reach their doorstep. Voss's lips curled, the closest thing to a smile he allowed. Then we don't give them what they expect. Elenya frowned. And what do you propose? Voss looked at the screen where Voritha's gaze lingered, frozen in the final moments of the transmission. A taunt. A dare. The general's fingers curled into a fist. We don't fight a war, he said. We end one. The preparations began at once. Across Earth's military districts, fleets were mobilized, weapons calibrated, soldiers briefed. But it was not a war effort in the traditional sense. There were no sweeping battle formations, no declarations of engagement. Voss had no intention of fighting the Council's armies on their terms. He was not sending battalions to die in glorious struggle. He was sending a dagger into the heart of the beast. The fleet was small, a fraction of what Earth could deploy, but each ship carried a purpose. Advanced cloaking, precision weaponry, infiltration specialists trained for one task alone, breaking through the Council's defenses, reaching the core of their power, and removing the head of the serpent. Voss stood on the command deck of the Leviathan, the flagship of the assault force. The bridge was quiet, its crew efficient, disciplined. No one questioned the mission. They had all seen the broadcast. They knew what failure meant. A voice crackled through the comms. General, final countdown before the jump. Voss nodded. He turned, surveying the gathered officers. You know why we're here, he said. You know what was taken from us. A pause. This isn't about retribution. It's about making sure they never do it again. No one spoke, but the air thickened with intent. The countdown reached 0. The ships vanished into the void. The journey to the Council's stronghold was not an easy one. Patrol routes had to be evaded, sensor grids bypassed. Voss's fleet moved like phantoms, slipping through cracks in the Council's vast surveillance net. Time stretched thin, every moment an exercise in patience. Then, at last, they arrived. The Council's primary station loomed ahead, a structure the size of a small moon, its surface bristling with defenses. It was not meant to be taken. No force had ever breached it. Voss studied the rotating schematics on his display. His mind mapped every corridor, every potential point of failure. The station was impenetrable to an army. But not to him. Deploy strike teams, he ordered. We're going in. As the first pods launched into the darkness, the battle had already begun. The strike teams moved like shadows, their entry pods piercing the Council station's outer defenses in silent bursts. No alarms sounded. No resistance met them. The impenetrable fortress, built to withstand entire armadas, had not prepared for ghosts. General Voss led the first team through the access corridors, his steps measured, his weapon steady. The air was sterile, humming with the quiet thrum of distant energy cores. His earpiece crackled as Commander Reyes, leading the second squad, whispered through the link. Sector 3 secure. No hostiles. Too easy. Voss knew better than to trust silence. The Council's arrogance was legendary, but they were not fools. The moment of reckoning would come, and when it did, it would be swift and merciless. He raised a hand, signaling his team forward. The objective was clear: reach the central chamber, disable station-wide defenses, and cut off the Council's command structure before they could react. A single strike, clean and final. The kind of war Voss specialized in. They reached the first checkpoint. A long hall stretched before them, lined with towering statues of past chancellors, their stone faces frozen in expressions of judgment. At the far end, a set of reinforced doors led into the Council's core. Beyond those doors, Vorath and his assembly awaited, oblivious to the blade at their throat. Voss gestured, and a demolitions expert knelt beside the control panel, fingers moving over the interface. A soft beep. A heartbeat of tension. The doors slid open. Inside, the chamber was vast, a circular arena of cold steel and burning light. The Council stood in their elevated seats, robed figures draped in shadows, their luminous eyes turning in unison toward the intrusion. No fear. No surprise. Voss stepped forward, rifle raised. His voice cut through the stillness. It's over. Chancellor Vorath did not rise. He merely exhaled, as though disappointed but unsurprised. His hands, long and skeletal, folded over his lap. You assume victory because you have entered our halls. Voss's grip tightened. Because you're out of time. A flick of Vorath's fingers. The chamber shifted. The floor beneath the strike teams pulsed with sudden energy, and gravity inverted in a violent surge. Soldiers were wrenched upward, thrown against unseen forces as automated turrets emerged from the walls. Bright bursts of plasma tore through the air. Chaos. Voss hit the ground hard, rolling into cover as shots ripped past him. His HUD flickered with casualty reports. They had walked into a snare, a carefully laid vice that was now closing with mechanical precision. But Voss did not panic. He had survived worse. He ripped a concussion charge from his belt, hurling it toward the turrets. The detonation sent a shockwave through the chamber, disrupting the artificial gravity long enough for his soldiers to regain control. Reyes' voice crackled through the comms. We're pinned, multiple hostiles incoming. Voss's mind worked fast. The Council had prepared for an invasion. But they had not prepared for him. He moved with lethal efficiency, weaving through the chaos, eliminating targets with practiced precision. His soldiers followed his lead, adapting, striking. What had begun as an ambush shifted into a brutal, close-quarters assault. Vorath remained seated, watching, studying. Even as his guards fell, he did not move. Voss reached the base of the Chancellor's dais, weapon trained on him. End it, Voss ordered. Vorath exhaled again, as though the weight of inevitability had finally settled upon him. Yet, there was something unreadable in his gaze. You believe killing me will change the tides? Voss's finger tightened on the trigger. I believe it will send a message. A pause. Then, Vorath smiled. Not in fear. Not in defeat. In amusement. You still don't understand, he murmured. Then, the station trembled. Warning sirens screamed to life. Through the chamber's high windows, the void beyond shifted, stars bending, space itself warping. Reinforcements. Not a fleet. Not an army. Something else. Voss's gut twisted. Vorath, still smiling, spoke his final words. You were never the predator in this war. Then, the universe fractured. The walls of reality groaned. A deep, unnatural vibration coursed through the Council station, warping the very air. General Voss braced against the shifting ground, his grip tightening around his weapon as his soldiers steadied themselves. The battlefield had changed, but the war had not. Beyond the towering windows, the void no longer resembled space as they knew it. Stars twisted into spirals, their light stretching unnaturally. Shadows moved where there should have been none. Something had arrived. Something vast. Voss turned his attention back to Vorath, still seated upon his dais, unshaken by the station's violent tremors. The Chancellor's luminous eyes shimmered with something beyond arrogance, something ancient. "You always believed this war was between Earth and the Council," Vorath murmured, his voice almost gentle. "That we feared humanity's strength." A pause. "We did not fear you. We feared what would come because of you." The chamber's walls split apart in jagged seams, revealing more of the shifting void beyond. Where once the Galactic Council had seemed untouchable, now they appeared insignificant, dwarfed by whatever force had answered the call. Reyes' voice burst through Voss's comm general. "We need an immediate extraction, something's tearing through the station. We've lost contact with half the squads." A high-pitched screech erupted from the darkness, cutting her off. The sound bypassed armor, bone, thought slamming directly into the mind. Soldiers staggered, some collapsing, weapons slipping from their hands. Voss clenched his teeth as the noise burrowed deep, scraping against the edges of his consciousness. A ripple passed through the void. Then, they emerged. At first, they were only distortions, as if space itself rejected their presence. Then, their forms solidified tall, elongated creatures of shifting black matter, their bodies pulsing with veins of violet energy. Their heads were eyeless, but they saw. Their mouths did not move, but their voices echoed in the minds of all who stood before them. "This realm was not yours to alter." The words slithered through Voss's skull, cold and absolute. The Council had not summoned reinforcements. They had not deployed a hidden fleet. They had done something far worse. They had opened a door. The creatures moved as one, stepping into the chamber with the slow inevitability of an executioner raising his blade. Voss fired first, instinct overriding the paralysis of his thoughts. Plasma rounds struck the nearest figure, passed through. The energy warped around its body, vanishing into nothingness. No effect. His soldiers followed his lead, unleashing a storm of fire. The chamber flashed with bursts of energy, but the creatures did not waver. One lifted a clawed hand. A soldier let out a strangled gasp as his body convulsed, lifting off the ground. His armor crumpled inward as if unseen fingers were crushing it. A sickening crunch, then silence. Voss adjusted. If conventional weapons failed, strategy remained. "Fall back," he barked. "Regroup at the extraction point, move." They obeyed without hesitation, breaking into defensive formations as they retreated. Vorath, still seated, watched them go, his expression unreadable. Voss lingered only a moment. "You knew." Vorath exhaled, not in triumph, not in sorrow, just acceptance. "We did what was necessary to prevent something worse." The station convulsed again. More fractures split through its walls, widening like wounds. The creatures did not chase the retreating humans. They did not need to. This battle was already over. Voss turned and ran. The corridors were collapsing. Fires burned where no oxygen should have allowed them to exist. The air itself had become unstable, thick with an oppressive pressure that threatened to pull them apart. Soldiers struggled forward, dragging the wounded, pushing toward the docking bay where the Leviathan and its remaining ships waited. Reyes stumbled beside him, her face pale, eyes darting between the crumbling station and the horrors pursuing them through the void. "What the hell are those things?" "Not our concern," Voss snapped. "We get out. We regroup. Then we decide if this war is still ours to fight." Ahead, the docking bay loomed. Emergency sirens blared as the last of the strike teams boarded. The ship's engines flared, the glow of its thrusters a beacon of salvation. They were going to make it. Then, the largest of the creatures stepped through the threshold. Its form towered above them, humanoid only in the vaguest sense. Its limbs were elongated, its presence warping gravity itself. It did not raise a hand. It did not attack. It only spoke. "This war is not yours. You are but echoes of a conflict older than your kind." Voss did not slow. He did not hesitate. He emptied his entire magazine into its center mass, knowing it would do nothing but refusing to acknowledge it. Reyes screamed, yanking him back just as the gravity around them shifted violently. The air turned razor-sharp, slicing through metal, flesh, thought. Soldiers fell, some simply ceasing to be. Then, the pressure snapped. The Leviathan's docking ramp pulled them in just as the bay collapsed, not into rubble, but into nothingness. A void of absolute absence. The doors sealed. The ship lurched forward, engines screaming as it tore away from the dying station. Voss pushed himself up, chest heaving. Through the viewport, the Council's fortress crumbled, swallowed piece by piece into the darkness. And the creatures remained. Watching. Waiting. Voss exhaled. The war had not ended. It had only changed.